panel es retos para...
The next panel is challenges for franchises in Latin America and in the United States, led by moderator Juan Carlos Uribe. The video, please.
Retos para las empresas
Challenges for the Latin American franchise businesses in the United States by Marc Lieberstein, Kilpatrick Townsend from the United States, Emiliano Jöcker from the iFranchise Group from the United States, moderator Juan Carlos Uribe, Triana, Uribe, and Michelsen, Colombia.
Hola a todos, por favor.
Good morning to all of you. Please take your respective seats. We're obviously previous to lunch, so we know that it's a bit complex. Very well. So within all this point, I really like or have the pleasure to present a dynamic team that is constituted by Marc and Emiliano. Marc is an attorney with an experience of dozens of years within the fields that have to do with the contract of franchises in different industries. And obviously he's an expert in topics of brands and copyright and the topic of right of franchises that specialize in the United States. He's a member of the ENG. He's been in different committees. He makes part of the ABA, which means in the professional groups of work that are quite big, and his experience is very extensive. And obviously he's a friend of several of you because he's also worked with ASIPI in different projects. Emiliano comes with us from another angle. Emiliano is an expert in what I would call like the gut of the franchise, or the business of franchises. A delicate and interesting topic that for us from the legal angle, we have low opportunities to approach. Most of the clients come to us asking us to redact a contract of franchising. Sometimes this franchising contract is a last stage of a full process of preparation, of a process of approaching an understanding of the business. That I remember that once a friend told me, or asked me better, or told me, hey, when you're building a franchise, it's like going to a psychologist, right? The psychologist will ask you, who are you? What are you looking for? What do you want? It's a process of self-discovery, and as we will see in the presentations that they will be giving us, it's an approximation of tuning up a lot of different points, shades, especially over an art that they like and know how to teach. A good franchisor is the person that knows that art of showing another person how your business is, how to operate it, and how to be loyal to that initial vision that the person had. So Marc and Emiliano will be giving us an interactive presentation amongst the two of them that will show us how a market as the United States, a very complex market and a process of maturity that is quite high, where some of the clients that they approach say, okay, I have 4 or 5 brands, I am Chile, Bolivia, Uruguay, I think that the Latin population or community of the United States are calling me, but I have 3 friends that have told me that I need a franchise of the business in Miami. What do I have to do? Obviously, here we have the people you could access. We have 2 experts in this field to show you that the market of the United States, being one of the most mature and most complex markets around the world, have a different elements that are different to our markets and invite to a great responsibility and care. But it doesn't necessarily imply that it's extremely impossible. It implies that you have to be a good strategist. So I'll give the word to Emiliano and Marc, so they may tell us all that wisdom that they have accumulated to be able to share it with you.
I'm going to speak in English. Emiliano can do English and Spanish. If you're sitting in the back, there's a lot of good content on the slides. You might want to move up. I would also say, I know Emiliano feels this way, but feel free to interrupt us. Ask questions if you have questions. We're happy to answer them. So Juan Carlos, why don't you start us off with our first question? You can take it to the next slide. I don't have the clicker. Technical difficulties. Gracias, señor.
Okay, so de lo que estábamos hablando es cuando le dice,
So basically what we're talking about is when your client tells you, okay, hey, when should I start considering going into the American market? Do you believe I'm mature enough? Well, here comes this topic within the presentation.
So before we even get to the actual answer to that question, you might say to yourself, well, what is a franchise in the United States? You may all have a concept of what it is in your respective countries in Latin America, but in the United States, it really means three things. Every franchise has to have, in order for it to be a franchise, three elements. I need the...
Estamos trabajando con él.
The three elements include, one, the agreement, the relationship must involve a trademark or other kind of indicia of origin. Okay, it could be a trade dress, could be a symbol, a logo, but it has to involve a trademark. The second element, which you could read on the slides if they put it up, the second element is a fee. There must be some kind of payment other than the payment for the price of the goods that are being involved or the services that are being provided, some kind of payment of a fee between the parties, from the franchisee to the franchisor. And the last element is the one that's a little bit I'll say controversial, right, Emiliano? The last element is there must be the provision by the franchisor of something called significant control or assistance to the franchisee. Bottom line, what it really means is that the franchisor must assert control over the operation of the franchisee, what it does every day, how it does it. Does it have to wear uniforms? What times it has to be open and closed? What kind of training? How must it operate the franchised business? And there's a distinction there, because you might be saying to yourself right now, is every trademark license a franchise? The answer is pretty darn close. The real distinctive difference between a franchise and a trademark license, a franchise agreement and a trademark agreement, is that in a trademark agreement, the licensor controls the trademark, how the trademark is used, what the trademark is put on, how the licensee uses the trademark, not the licensee's business. The licensee makes its own products, uses its own manufacturers. They may require approval from the licensor, but the licensor is not involved in what the manufacturer actually does on a day-to-day basis, what the licensee does on a day-to-day basis. That's really the difference between the franchise and the trademark license. Emiliano?
Si prefieren en español, sigo en español, o si quieren en inglés, como sea más fácil para todos.
If you want Spanish, or in English, however you want.
El
United States is a strong market. The fee of the franchise generates in the economy of the United States around $827 billion. Remember that the billions in the United States are 1,000 million from our side. I'm sorry, we're having difficulties trying to pass the slides. We don't know what happened. It's just Murphy's Law. If you want, you can raise your hand, and from the panel, they'll just pass the slides, okay? I'm sorry, it's something unpredictable. Equally, if you want to change it from the table, it could be possible. We just raise our hands and they'll change it. If you could please put it in the second slide, if you're so kind.
No, I'm sorry. Slide number 4.
la cuarta.
Equally, I shall proceed while we try to find the correct image. Equally, what I was talking about, or what I wanted to tell you about, is that economical strength that is generated by the segment of franchising. There we are. Almost 800,000 units in franchising, generating almost $827 billion that generate 8.5 million jobs. A segment As you might know, that is very strong. And from there, $276 billion are only a part, which has to do with foods and the restaurants of fast foods, followed by the business services that generate around $100 billion. And in the same way, the next categories that will follow will be restaurants, real estate, full service, and everything that has to do with residential and commercial services in terms of cleaning and, well, other kind of employment. One back, please. We overpassed the slide. An important point to consider is that the United States as a market is simply to ask how big is the Latin American world and how strong is this segment becoming. It became in the biggest minority. It's a group that is growing at a tremendous volume, 62 million counted in 2020. We can calculate that there is a bit more that cannot be counted. But what, from those that we can count, it's 62.1 million inhabitants. It's the equivalent to Colombia and Chile altogether. It's a tremendous segment. And as you might see in the map, they're not only in the South Belt, that is the southern part, that historically is the transition of Hispanics and everything, but they're also strong in the north and the west and the east and the center, everywhere. So they are growing at an amazing rate. It is estimated that towards 2060, this number will grow up to 111 million inhabitants of Latin American population, consumers that have that connection with the Latin world, the family, their nation, their culture. So it's certainly a segment that must not be ignored. And for those that are looking for another market, perhaps this could be one of those reasons to go into the North American market. Within the states that we have seen that have a big rate of growth, it's not only the bordering states with Mexico, but we also have other states: Texas, Florida, Arizona, South Carolina, Idaho, Tennessee, North Carolina, Montana, Nebraska, and Nevada. Part of what makes them attractive, or that makes them an appealing and strong state for franchising, is the fact of the economies, the fact of those statal rule sets. It's the fact of how easy may a business move and grow, and the migration in those states. There's always a small growth in certain states. People, due to migration, age, weather, sometimes want to move to other places, even sometimes for working reasons. We're going into the virtual world where you don't need to go to an office, that you can work from home. So people try to look for a place where perhaps the weather is a bit more benevolent. And within all these conditions, one of the most important for franchise world are the state legalities. Remember that in the United States, we have two umbrellas: the legal umbrella, and then each state makes a different regulation.
I mean, these states make up a pretty large part of the United States, but keep in mind, in the United States, there are two governing rules and regulations of franchise. There's the federal level, the national federal government regulations, and then, remember, there are 50 states in the United States. Each one is like its own little world. Each one has its own laws and separate laws that govern franchises. Some of those states, if you're going to remember one slide in this presentation, this should be it. There are 14 states that are different from the others. They require something other than a franchise disclosure document. They require registration, which means that before you can offer and sell a franchise in that state, you must first file your franchise documents and submit an application to make offers to sell a franchise in that state. The state regulators will then look at the franchise submission, make sure it's in compliance with state law, and then approve or disapprove or tell you what's wrong with it, and you have to make changes in order to make offer and sell of franchises in those states. What's really interesting is that on that prior slide, those top 10 states are not registration states. If you're not a registration state, it's much easier to enter the United States via franchising than the 14 states that require the application. So we usually try to guide clients that are coming into the United States from overseas and tell them, you know, Florida's a little easier than New York or California. Arizona is easier. Texas is easier. Go to the states where it's easier to enter into the franchise marketplace first. And then once you see success, you can then go and file applications to register your franchise in those other states. But for all states, for all 50 states, both the registration states and the 36 other states, you must have, what I used that term before, a franchise disclosure document. I'm going to use the phrase FDD to shorten that because it's a mouthful. But you need a franchise disclosure document or an FDD no matter what, regardless of what state you're in, unless there are exemptions. And exemptions, as you can see on the slide, there are certain requirements certain rules about exemptions under the state laws and the federal laws. I won't go into all of them, but one of them in particular is, if you are a large franchisee, if you're doing a deal with a very large entity in the United States, where their net worth is, I think it's over $5 million, over $6 million, then you do not need a franchise disclosure document. You also will be exempt in most of those 14 states from having to file an application to register the franchise. Why? Well, in the United States, franchise law really developed because in the old days, there were these entities they called them snake oil salesmen. These people were selling things that were frauds and fakes, and people were investing and buying them in order to make money, and they were getting ripped off all the time. So the franchise laws are really designed around trying to avoid that snake oil salesman type of situation, to avoid fraud. And so if you're a large franchisee, though, the government assumes, and the state government assumes, that you're smart. You're smart enough. You don't need a franchise disclosure. You're going to ask the questions. You're going to get the answers you need. You're going to be able to make an educated decision before you invest. So that's why you would be exempt. So under certain states, and even under certain federal laws, you could be exempt from the requirements of disclosure and maybe even exempt from registration in those 14 states. There are also some other laws you need to be aware of. Even if you're not a franchise, there are some laws called business opportunity laws that govern certain kinds of relationships that may not be quite a franchise. In other words, they may not have all those three elements, but they're still governed by these business opportunity laws, and you may have to make a state filing of some sort. Usually it's one piece of paper, you fill it out, you file it with the government, you pay a small fee, and you're good to go. And you have to be careful. You have to really consult with a US lawyer to find out which of these states has the different requirements, and so on and so forth. But again, in those states, it's usually much easier to enter and start to do business right away.
Este gráfico.
Now, this table tells a bit the story in the last 5 years of the growth throughout different segments in the industry. Obviously, pulling out 2020, which was an immense hit to all of us in terms of coronavirus. And we can see some numbers in red. The growth has been post-pandemic, and it's been so strong and so stable as before the pandemic. In certain cases, we have seen a greater growth even. So we can certainly say that the industry is as strong as ever. Now, within the brands that many of us might know, the top three, KFC, 7-Eleven, and McDonald's. Sometimes they change position amongst them. Sometimes McDonald's is the first one, sometimes it's the third position. But let's say that those are the MVP players in the world of franchises. And they've had many years. Remember that McDonald's has been franchising since 1955. They have many decades of experience, and they generate an economical movement in a number of units aside of this that is really admirable. However, the point that I want to mention is that not all of us are McDonald's, not all of us are KFC, of course, and effectively 70% of the franchise world have less than 50 units, less than 50 franchises, which means that most of the people of the companies that are within this world of franchises are not these monsters as McDonald's with more than 30,000 units. Only 6% of those franchisers have more than 500 units within their chains. And you might see there a bit of that information of how that 34% is broken down. So you can see the different numbers, 15, 10, and others in terms of growth. Within the categories that we were speaking before, here we have a bit more of information in terms of the specific growth that they've had. Commercially, residentially, in terms of services, franchises in these segments have grown around 76,000 units. It's impressive, really amazing. And in the world of real estate, that in 2020 was a bit in halt due to the pandemic. In 2021, they had an acceleration because it was like 2 years together in terms of growth. So they advanced in the sense of everything that they could not grow in 2020. So in general, you see a stable growth and a successful growth. Within those factors that we always mention of what makes me important or why would I like to go to North America, to the United States specifically, one of the obvious points is the size of the market. We could be talking, well, the first point that we mentioned is that economical force that is generated due to the quantity of people, the consumption, and the space we have for that quantity of brands for different elements. How many cleaning services are there? How many competitors are in the same fields? So this makes it attractive. There's a space for everyone. Now, the maturity of the franchisor is something that also makes the market more attractive. Maturity and the education of the franchisor, people that every day consume and live in this world of, in the universe of franchises. They know what to do and what to consume in the franchising. The legal frameworks that are there to not only protect the franchisor but the franchise. And when we talk about this program of franchising, we have to create a win-win-win scenario. 3 portions have to win. The franchisor, the person that is buying the franchisor must win, and the consumer must win. That the consumer goes and buys a Dunkin' Donuts in Texas or in Massachusetts, and the flavor, the system, the image must be uniform, standardized, the same. So achieving this kind of standard and uniform kind of world. And another side, the technology and the information that the franchisors are using. There's a lot of information that's used as a guide. This, as we call, the one that starts marking the path to that new franchisor that says, hey, don't do this, you're going to lose money. If you're going to lose money if you consume a lot of this. They have an internal access of information. And this, as well as knowing how the competitors are moving, what makes them different? Why are they winning some part of our territory or other elements? Finally, one of the most important points in the United States has to do with the access to money, to loans. Banks have the trend of relaxing a bit the demands when an individual is trying to buy a franchise. Understanding that if, well, there are no warranties because nothing is completely secure in life or insured in life, these are models that are tested, and the bank perhaps understands that there will be less risk if they're going to buy something that has a system of support that will allow them to have that money back.
I mean, the translator said banks. I don't know if you said venture capital and private equity.
In this case, it would be loaners of everything, of course. It could be everything that has to do with facilitating the money or the initial investment to be able to go in this. There are some franchisors that also finance the people that are buying the franchise. There is a question that comes out from the perspective of the Latin American businessman when they want to go into the North American market. Who can help them access the clients, and what kind of documents or what has to go with them so they can also present themselves to the financial system of North America, so that whenever the person that's buying the franchise or when the franchisor is saying, hey, I have this wonderful franchise in Brazil, and the person that's going to go and look for the loan to buy that franchise, they can also show in the bank and say, hey, but who is that Brazilian? How have you seen this part? How's the equation work? Aside of other practical considerations of being able to take this business into the United States. Yes, thank you for the question. Basically, the maturity of the franchisor, how they move and how they develop themselves and how they disinvolve in the industry, is something that the franchisor or the candidate that will be buying the franchise feel attracted towards that. because they know that they will be taken care of, that the investment going into that business will be protected by the franchise. There are certain features and there are certain forms or ways that facilitate for those franchisors in the United States in particular to be more appealing. That's people that want to invest and go into this world. Amongst these is that the franchisor normally has a lot of experience in their own corporate world. Before being a franchise or franchisor, they created a business model that was perfect. It's a tuned up machine, oiled up machine that has almost no errors or zero errors, that have an access to a team of work, that they have access amongst many things to a culture that believes in that brand, that invests in making that person that is buying the franchise feels part of the brand, that he's listened, that he's respected, that he feels like a fan of the brand. Creating that culture validates the system, makes a franchisor to say, okay, I have a group of 50 units that are fanatics, that are fans of the brand, that want to grow with us. And effectively, in the United States, from every 10 franchisors, 3 will come back to buy an additional territory of that same brand. So let's say if you have 10 franchises, in the near future, 3 more territories will be sold internally with people that are already moving in the system that want to buy another portion of the map to keep on working with the franchises. That's very common to be seen, and a franchisor sometimes can have many territories with the same brand. This has to do with the behavior of the franchisor. If they had not earned that respect or that connection, that place that allows that they must have, it would be a brand that would fail. Therefore, it is important to listen and be sure that we will give enough support to that franchisor to be successful. Because definitely the success in franchises is precisely that, the 10, 20 years in which the franchise will be going.
The legal issues, the communication between the franchisee and the franchisor is so, it's imperative, and it's imperative that it takes place, because if it doesn't, chances are the franchisees are going to feel ignored. They're going to feel left out. They're going to feel that their needs or whatever it is they need to be successful is just not happening. And that usually indicates, in the end, that a franchise system will likely fail. So that particular point, I think it should be stressed. And if you can show that that's how you've behaved in your respective country in Latin America with your brand and your system, and you can present that, if you have a franchise association or a franchisee council already in your systems in Latin America, that's going to be a very good indicator for a bank, for an investor, that this brand, this franchisor knows what they're doing. That's a successful factor in the United States that the investors are going to be looking at.
Entre las razones por las que marcas de
Amongst the reasons that brands in Latin America want to expand in the United States or internationally is to be in different markets at the same time. The advantages are that if the local economy is failing, the brand keeps on winning because the economy is also in another country. And it's also the fact of making the brand bigger, using the resources that they have and being able to expand over an existing platform, having access to capital and people in other markets. But one of the things that I want to emphasize and I want to highlight are the reasons for which we shouldn't go. Those things that I listen commonly, the bragging rights, saying, "Oh, we have a store in Miami, right? So, yeah, we sold in Madrid. We have offices in this other place, and." Having a plan, having a structure, giving it enough support, not to say that I'm going to go into another market, but to be able to say that I have in a big city a store, because perhaps they left alone someone in a market, that's not good for the brand. And it happens constantly, and it's when an investor comes and says, hey, I have this money, I'm going to go and buy, and I want to take my brand to Florida, Miami. because I'm interested in having a visa and I can buy an apartment. My children can study in the United States and use this as a business model. And this is an investor that has other reasons. It's not to only be an ambassador in that market, but they also have that personal interest that perhaps is not aligning with what the business needs. Another could be because the competition is there. My competition went to New York, so I want to be there as well. Well, perhaps the competition has another rhythm, another muscle, has another nervous system. You don't have to be motivated because your competition is doing it. And the other thing is thinking that it's easy, that I can sell franchises, that someone will give me money. Yet, to make money, you have to invest money.
So we have to have a structure, we have to have a team, we have to provide support to that franchise so that it might be successful in that territory. We are signing contracts for 10 to 20 years with that individual. And so we have to make sure that they have whatever tools are needed in order to succeed. Among other factors, I'm just complimenting your question, Juan Carlos, it's how to enter a new market. You have a system, a prototype, a model that's working, or to have systems, internal systems for operation. You have everything that you need in terms of measurement and testing it in that market. What works in Colombia will not necessarily work in the United States. The cost of business in Argentina is probably different from what the cost in the United States. So the cost of rents, to test that and recognize that it'll have an impact on the royalties you'll be charging, and understand why royalties are from 4 to 10% of revenue, why you have to give me as $50,000 as an initial payment to become a part of my brand. All of this information so that the franchisor has the adequate money in order to have proactively support available and people available in order to provide that safety net so that the franchisees don't fall apart.
In the room. Lawyers have to know when developing that franchise offer, they're probably not the right person. The lawyer should tell the client, I'm the legal guy or woman. You need to speak to someone like Emiliano. You need to speak to a business person who can tell you what are the competitive royalty rates, what are the competitive prices, what may be the best location for my particular system. There are data sets that Emiliano has access to, which most lawyers don't, and which I think can really assist your clients if they're thinking about the United States as a marketplace, or one of the states in the United States as a marketplace, to get the right data so you can develop that right offer that will match the opportunity that's available.
Sí, thank you, Marc. No los quiero aburrir, pero básicamente la información esa se te...
And I don't want to bore you, but that information is, I'll say it just as a description, a cost plus analysis. What's the minimum that the franchise has to charge for everything that they'll do? And that's the low part. And then above this, the upper part of the structure, that 4 to 10% of revenue is what does the competition do? How do they move in the industry? And we use that as a parameter. And then in the middle, where does this person want to be positioned? Do they want to be a premium franchisor or discount, or who do they want to be as a brand? That will determine those rates. But it is very important to study these expenses, the cost of training an individual. What will the salary be for a person who will be available 24 hours a day, more or less? And what's the cost of the legal aspects of this, the cost of consultants? All of this, when these rates are charged, it's a fund for potential recovery for all of the investment of the franchisor in order to enter this world of franchises. Then there are royalties. This is where it's the profit center. It's where the franchisor will actually make money. The money is not in selling franchises, it's in the royalties. Selling franchises is important, but there's a little of that money that it turns into a profit because it is all assigned to the expenses. The money in that world is in royalties. In that 10 to 20 year relationship that you'll have, that transaction, 4 or 10% of royalties on the sale of a sandwich, 2 sandwiches, 30 sandwiches per day, that's what's important to understand. When you go to another market, you have to test those numbers, and we assume that the numbers in the business in that country may be wrong or right, but we do have to validate anyway.
Las cosas que queremos conversar.
Among the things we have to talk about is what steps we can begin to take, what small movements can be made proactively in the search of entering new markets. Among them, something that Marc is an expert on is the registering of trademarks.
Key, as most of you probably know, the franchise, the brand, the trademark is probably the most important asset. But if there's one thing I would want you to remember from anything that I say today, it's that in the United States, trademark rights are earned by use, not registration, which is what it is in most of I think all of the Latin American countries, and really most of the world except for maybe the UK, Australia, and Canada. So in order to really get trademark rights in the United States, you don't necessarily need to register your trademark. It is very important to register, especially if you're going to be franchising, because that exempts you from a lot of local state requirements. But you need to make use. And one of the things that I usually counsel my clients who are coming in from overseas is, have you tried your brand out in the United States? I think many of you may be familiar with the Chevy brand called Nova. Anybody remember that? Well, if you don't know, Chevy tried to roll out a car called Nova, which in Spanish means, even I know, no go. So they were trying to sell a car that didn't move. Chevy didn't think to test out its brand, what it meant, what it would mean to consumers. And one of the things you can do in the United States is, very easily, set up a pop-up, go to a trade show, right? Or go to a fair, a food fair if you're a restaurant. Set up a small stand, put your brand out there, see how people react, see if people like your food, right? You can test, and that's a use, that is a trademark use, especially if you do it more than once. And if you do that over the course of time, you can really figure out if your brand is going to work in the United States. Now, one of the things you really have to do also is clear your trademark. In other words, before you get here, you have to make sure that your trademark is available for use and registration. It's not just registration. And by use, that means you can't just go to the uspto.gov website and see what's been registered. You have to go into Google. You have to go into the state databases. You have to go into all the internet available websites. You have to see what's going on the ground in all the different states, see if anybody's using your mark. Social media is another place where you have to check for use. And usually we recommend when you do clearance in the United States, especially before you're about to make a huge investment in your brand for franchising here, you want to check out and you want to spend the money on what is known as a full clearance search, which means that you're not relying on a human being to do the search. You're relying on the experts, the vendors who have these software algorithms that can search all those different database sets to see if there's a use of the trademark that's out there and make sure your mark is clear for use. It's a really important thing to do as a very, I'll call it initial step before you're thinking about the United States. And again, it can be done very inexpensively, once assuming you can use your trademark, by doing all of these little things like the pop-ups or the surveys and the little tests before you invest in a big location or in a facility and a lease and all these other things. You can get that done very easily, quickly, and probably inexpensively.
Seguido de lo que sugiere Marc,
after what Marc suggests, we have to try to understand the market that we're going to enter. If the franchisor works in a certain segment, in pizzerias, and we have to know that when we go to the United States to compete in that sector, there are players who have been there for many years, who know their systems by memory and have a clear identity. For example, Pizza Hut is not saying it's the cheapest pizza. There's another brand that will say that. And each of them kind of keep a certain line. They don't pretend to be something they're not. They have a clear identity. So, understanding who we are and what's the best thing the brand has to offer, know who we'll be competing with. And having a well-developed system, a tested system, in the country of origin or in the country that we're seeking to enter. Know what the rules of the game are, what will be required. Test a prototype, have legal documents, FTDs, that's very important. And make sure that the operations manual and the legal documents do connect. And we have to close the door to potential misunderstandings or lawsuits. No one wants to enter this world to end up having misunderstandings with their franchisees. It's important that the legal documents made by a lawyer and the operations manual don't give way for loopholes or misunderstandings where we have issues with those concepts, where the food ends up with a different flavor, or that you might even see cases of food poisoning. Sometimes a lot of information can be risky as well. It's about the right information. So working with lawyers, consultants, people who know how to put those documents together, which will serve as a platform or the base of your program. And we have to understand well that
Structure of the franchise agreement.
Exacto.
So I'm not going to run down all of these things, but what Emiliano just said really takes us to this next step, which is what are the parties agreeing to? And I mean, it's the fees and the royalties, that's all pretty easy. What technology is going to be used? Hopefully the franchisor has developed the best way to operate, or its best way to operate. But if I had to point out just two things on this about the structure of many franchise agreements in the United States, and these are the most common terms you'll see, is the franchise association. That's what I mentioned before. That's where the franchisor says, hey, I'm going to give the franchisees a chance to talk to each other and to talk to me, the franchisor. Tell me what's working. Tell me what's not working. Some franchisors don't have that provision. The better ones do. And that type of communication usually makes for a more successful franchise. The other one that I would really point out is the termination of a franchise. Some states make it very, very difficult to terminate a franchise. You have to have special, important, like really strong reasons and grounds for doing that. And I know in Latin America, I actually learned this from Luis Daneman, that in Latin America you have a similar thing where it's not easy sometimes to terminate your relationships. Well, similarly in the United States, many states do not permit you to just terminate a franchise unless there's a really good reason, good cause for doing so. And the last one is the redesign update obligations. Many franchisees think that once they open up, they're done. They never have to do anything, no updates. The trademark is always going to look the same. Well, brand owners usually change their way their brands look. They usually change the way their stores look and how consumers interact with the brand. And over time, things get modernized. And usually it's over 5 years. That's kind of the standard. Sometimes it's 10 years. It depends upon the industry that you're in. But there's a lot of negotiation usually around those terms because the franchisee is making an investment up front, and then it has to understand that it may have to make another investment in 5 to 10 years. So just be aware of these most common terms in many franchise agreements, and maybe highlight those three to think about and consider before you come into the United States.
Al punto que marca Marc a lo último, el caso de McDonald's 1955.
There's a case of McDonald's, and when they started to franchise, they only had 14 items on their menu. Today, they have so many more. Today, things look very different. There are drive-thrus now. They have Ronald McDonald Happy Meals, a little toy box. There's so many things, but the look of the business has changed as well. So the businesses are always in a state of evolution. And they're always transforming and they're adjusting to the needs of the consumer. And so it's important to have legally written that if the market requires it, will change.
Trademark lawyers in the room, many of you may be familiar with the new brand restrictions about how brands, they may not be able to show Ronald McDonald's anymore because it's advertising to children, and now there's new laws around you can't advertise to children. So these kinds of modernizations of the brand are important to be thinking about and make sure your franchisees know about when they enter into the franchise agreement.
Estas son algunas de las marcas que nosotros hemos trabajado.
These are some of the brands that we've worked with. Our consultants that came from abroad to the United States. These have been very successful. From Argentina, Korea, in general, from all over. There are people entering, but still there's more that can be done. So 40% of the people who seek to buy a franchise say that they're open to new things. They don't just all want to go with what's most certain in the brand that's been active for years and that has a large branding. So this is a giant opportunity. 40% are open to the idea of something else, a new player, a new concept. So keep in mind that this is part of an opportunity to seek a future in another market. Brazil, the same. There are 163 brands in the world. The United States is one of those countries where 2020 had 61 brands. And so this is a point that I want to share. We worked with Pollo Campero from Guatemala, where they started to franchise in the United States almost in 2000. But they had a functioning model. Their success is due to their preparation. It's due to them taking things step by step and not rushing, not just because they worked with us, but because they carried out their studies and grew without going through a tsunami of things. They said no to a lot of people to be certain, to bring them with time and give them the support that was deserved. They had a line of people for 7 hours waiting to buy from their menus. And so this speaks to, or it's a testimony to the preparation and to work with people who are experts on the subjects that can help you to improve your franchise programs. For the reasons, there's a question here that has to do with a concern we had. Just like a bad singer shouldn't go to a reality to test out their voice, there are certain companies that aren't ready to enter the market. And there are some horror stories that have been told when, due to overconfidence, they try to enter this world. But there are circumstances that can lead to failure when they don't assess their their level of preparation adequately. Right, it's common for brands to arrive in the United States, and they use that to basically like a way of assigning visas almost to their employees from abroad to try to grow the brand that way, and it's so complicated. The franchisees, the master franchisee in some cases, isn't local. They don't know the culture. They make mistakes. They get distracted and don't demonstrate that the company, that the business is profitable, that it generates employments, which is the reason why the U.S. government gave them a permission in the first place. And so they lose the visa, and that all of that effort, the whole brand loses, and this person has to return to their country, and the brand is left hanging. And so if you're going to use a method of expansion where you're going to allow for the use of visas, there are cases of franchises in Argentina that have been left in the middle of nowhere because they had to return. They had a plan of growing a brand. Another matter is to assume that adaptation is just to convert your operations manual into English. No, you have to understand that culture. We are all Hispanic here, but the things that work in Ecuador don't necessarily work in Chile or in Colombia. And so we have to be certain that we understand the culture. We have the case of U.S. concepts that we try to apply to Mexico. And aside from making the documentation, they failed for 5 years because they had an attitude of not adapting to what the market was expecting. In the case of Ace Hardware, it was a monster in the United States. They couldn't sell franchises when they understood that it wasn't just a matter of translating an operations manual, but providing support and making the franchisee feel like part of a culture. That's when the brand started to sell. The validation among franchisees, where a candidate came up and they would ask, what's hardware like? What's this? No, they're very good. They're here to help you. That kind of validation makes people buy more.
There's that Emiliano and I talked about was this fear of litigation in the United States. I know everyone thinks of the United States as the most litigious country on the planet. It probably is. But in the franchise world, it's really not. Go to that last
The one before?
that slide with the quote. No, back at the back of the deck. Go forward. There's a quote. There's a quote. I found a quote from one of the leading franchise practitioners. Keep going. It's the litigation one on slide 35.
Okay.
Keep going. It's all the way. Keep going. And what you'll find is that more than half of franchisors and franchisees polled.
This one?
Yep, that's the study. It's a study that was done. So according to a recent study of almost 2,500 franchisors, FDDs, 50, and the FDD is the disclosure. In the franchise disclosure document, you need to disclose if there's been litigation between the franchisor and its franchisees. 54% of franchisors had experienced no franchise litigation at all. That's a big number. That's over half of all the franchisors in the United States. No litigation at all. And another 16% only had one lawsuit over the last 10 years. 88% with 500 or more units, those are the big franchisors, reported 5 or fewer lawsuits over the previous 10 years. And only 7 franchisors with 1,000 plus units reported over 50 lawsuits over 10 years, which is, in the overall scheme of things, very, very small. Now, is litigation increasing in the United States, especially over non-business issues like employment, labor, privacy? Yes, but that's almost any business will have those things happen to it. It's not specific to franchising, but this fear of litigation in the United States should be somewhat mitigated, especially in light of this particular survey and what we found. And I thought it would be important for all of you to hear that.
Sí, incluso monstruos como McDonald's.
Right, and monsters like McDonald's, the reasons for which they've gone through litigations, or it's not the franchisees. Okay, one more. This has to do with often consumers. The coffee was too hot. The food is making my children obese. Things like that, and but not the franchisees. And the only thing they have in their disclosure is they have to say what those cases are. There's one from a franchisee that doesn't pay on time, and so the brand is trying to clear that. And so the franchisees that do things well don't have legal conflicts. And it's important to have legal documents and an operations manual that closes the door and the windows to any opportunity for franchisee to have these kinds of troubles. In the case of David Hood, the president of NTN Pretzels, I believe, you may not be familiar when you go to the airport in the United States, they're everywhere. For 10 years, he was the president of NTN Pretzels, and during those 10 years, he created the company from 0 to 650 units and never won lawsuit. Again, this is about preparation, about doing things well, working with people who know how to make these documents, and you train and provide the necessary support and have a franchisee in a format of the right format where they're happy, enjoying the brand, and being a fan of the brand. You can eliminate that world of litigation. Another point I'd like to mention, when we talk about the strategies that we use to enter other markets, and they're not just single unit but we use the master franchisee concept, which is someone that knows how to develop an area of a country. Direct own, which is the ones that come and mix a franchise with the opening of their own corporate locations. For many years, I worked with Bathfitter, a Canadian company where we opened 400 units. I was owner of territories that we franchised in the south. I bought those territories, and at the same time, the franchisor had certain territories that we had saved for corporate growth. Joint ventures is another format.
Structures and the unit by unit agreement structures. Those are the most common. Joint venture, not so much, although sometimes. And a master agreement, I know many of you probably are used to masters, and outside the United States, master agreements are relatively common for franchising to expand. But in the United States, there's a legal hurdle with the master franchise relationship, in that you need a dual franchise disclosure document. So in other words, the master franchisor has to have an FDD, and the master franchisee has to have an FDD. And in those 14 registration states, each entity has to also register with the state. So there's a sort of double expense and double work to do. It's not impossible, but that dual layer of, let's call it, administrative procedure is required. And it's not the most, it's really very rarely used in the United States to expand and enter into the United States with your franchise. The other thing that I would say, which I don't think Emmy said, I'm not sure I got all the translation, but this decision about what structure to use is very much driven by taxes, especially coming from Latin America. There's all kinds of taxes on the revenue that may or may not be coming out of the United States. You may want to set up a U.S. subsidiary company to run the whole operation, the whole franchise. You may want to set up a joint venture and let the joint venture, the U.S. joint venture entity, operate the whole franchise thing. There may be good tax reasons to file that corporate entity in, let's say, Delaware, or maybe Texas or Florida, where there's no income tax on employment. So you have to, these are usually tax decisions. I'm not a tax lawyer. This is where I always tell people, I know where my expertise starts and stops. It stops at tax advice. I do not give tax advice, but I would urge all of you to, if your clients are considering coming to the US, speak to a tax consultant. I think even Emmy would say he's not a tax person either. So you got to speak to those tax people to let them help you decide what's the best structure, what's the best way to get the most revenue out of the United States that is not taxable.
Parte del asesoramiento que nosotros hacemos como consultores.
Part of the advisory that we provide is understanding the nature of the business. If the business can better expand under the model of franchising and has all the elements in place, or licenses or joint ventures, or whatever it might be, and don't try to force a business to enter a legal world. Instead, let the business tell you what the best legal format is in order to help in the expansion or growth of that business. Here Emiliano has a very interesting slide, and I think everything that we've been talking about summarizes this in the space of reflection. It's like the year of the invitation and the preparation, that where we have to have the steps and what we have to do in order to enter the North American market, so that you might enter that point and considering time. So the fundamental pillars, which are, I think, evident. Common sense is sometimes not so common, but we have to understand time. What are the goals we have? What knowledge do we have of the market? What capital is required to do things well? To enter the world of franchises, thinking that we'll just sell 3 franchises in the first month and then reinvest. No. Having the adequate funds and ways to provide the necessary push out of respect to the franchisee, we need to support them for them to be successful. Invest in relationships. The relationship, we've said this so many times, and we see it all the time. Often we are hired by franchisors because they say things aren't going well. They have conflicts, and we call Mr. Shoppers, is there? We try to figure out why, carry out an analysis of what's happening, and it tends to be the same thing. The franchisor isn't listening to us, or we feel like we don't have a voice or a vote, so let them participate. there's a bunch of limits and things where the franchisee has no way out, that they have to follow certain steps. There's a regular conduct, but creating some flexibility, a world in which they feel like they're a part of the brand, helps the strategy. How many resources do we have and where they're going? How do we maximize our growth with an adequate strategy? Entering a country with the size of the United States and selling a franchise in Maine and another in Oregon and another in Florida, and so to go visit them, you'll spend a week on a plane. The franchisees have to wait for 4 days for you to show up. You've spent the resources, all of your resources in those visits. Why not think of a strategy where we might say, who is in that market? Who's in that segment? I'm going to begin growing by starting small. I'll begin in one state, and when I'm okay in this region, I'll grow farther. So using those internal and local resources to support the franchisees. Basically, if I need help today, I need an answer today, and we have to be at the service of these franchisees. That's very important.
But
So I'll just say this in a simple way. Basically, it has to do with the first step, analyzing and the error of that 1%. When a franchisor charges 1% more, that brings an economical impact to the brand. And this is simple economics. Now, thinking, or let's suppose that the business gives $500,000 in terms of rent per year, and you lose 1% because that 1% was wrongly calculated. You lose a lot of money per year. And if that chain has 100 franchises, and the legal term that it signed for, that franchisor just lost $50 million, sorry. And you have to think that in the United States, the world of franchises is sold. It's a hot sell. We see clients that are sending their brands up to 17 times the earnings. So thinking that it's an average of only 10, the quantity of money that can be lost by a simple error because they didn't do the homework correctly, because they didn't work at the beginning with consultants, lawyers, and they didn't go through all the steps they should have gone, they could go into a conflict of losing money. And there are brands that have failed. And they were as big as Subway. They sold franchises like crazy, but they didn't have the money to give enough support because they didn't make the correct calculation of royalties. So going into the market thinking that they're going to copy Pizza Marco's because my pizza is similar, what Marco's Pizzeria charges is what works for their business, not for yours. So you must do your own task and try not to collapse.
But a lot of this time, a little bit with the legal, a lot of the business. Now I'm going to take the last few minutes and just go through some of the legal things you can think about. I realize we stand between you and your afternoon activities, so I'll try to go quickly. We already went through the different structures and discussed that. These are some really important legal issues to consider about location and expansion, the registration state versus the non-registration state. We went through that before as well. This is a slide that I thought was important for you all to see. This is the franchise disclosure document. It is a beast. It is usually 200 to 300 pages, sometimes more, depending upon the industry that you're in. But these are all the items that have to be disclosed about your business. You'll see on here several things. You have to discuss litigation. You have to disclose bankruptcy. You have to disclose everything. Essentially, you are pulling your pants down for the franchisee to see everything about you and what you are and who you have been over the last, usually you have to give data for the last 3 years. You have to, one of the most important things that many foreign entities coming to the US don't realize is they need financial accounting statements for the last 3 years. If you're a new entity coming to the US, you could probably get away with unaudited financial statements, but for the most part, you will need to have financially audited financial statements in place after your second year in business in the United States. Those are not expensive, and you have to use the generally accepted accounting principles that are commonplace and the only things that are accepted in the United States. So you have to be aware of these things. Most importantly for you intellectual property attorneys is that item 13 and 14 of the FDD require disclosure about your intellectual property, your patents, your trademarks, your trade secrets, your copyrights, really anything that you believe is of value to your company. And I tried to make a comprehensive list of all the things that can be covered by the FDD and that should be disclosed. We already discussed the different trademarks. I gave a longer list over here. But what about copyrights and patents and trade secrets? Well, copyrights and patents differ from trademarks in that copyrights and patents are governed by statute, and they do have a limited lifetime. Patents are usually done after 20 years from filing, and design patents are 15 years, whereas trademarks live forever as long as the trademark is in use. Copyrights cover a lot of the things that most franchisors think are valuable. Menus in a restaurant situation, operations manuals, basically anything that's printed or designed or is original expression to the franchisor is copyrightable, and you can register your copyrights in the United States Copyright Office for very little money. It's really not a big investment. And the more intellectual property assets of value that you have, arguably the more important and the more value you can get from your franchise entity. Similarly with patents, many systems have superior or unique novel methods of operation, systems or maybe even software or methods of operation. You can file for patent applications in the United States. If you maybe you filed them in your respective countries here, I'm hopeful that most of the patent attorneys are familiar with the PCT applications. You can get protection for your patents in the United States as well, and those can be part of the asset value equation in your franchise disclosure document. And the last one is trade secrets. Many franchisors don't really promote the fact that the secret sauce about how their franchise operations are successful could very well be the subject of a trade secret. But in the United States, you have to be careful because you only have a trade secret if you and your franchisees and their employees are actually maintaining the secret. In other words, keeping it confidential, not posting it on a bulletin board or publishing it on the internet. Making sure that everyone in the business, including all the franchisees and their employees, understand that the ingredients to that ice cream mixture that goes into the machine are not to be disclosed. That's the trade secret. Once you have that, that could be a very valuable proprietary asset that you'd be able to hopefully earn value from, and which you don't have to disclose your trade secrets in the FDD, but you at least have to identify what it is. So you could say ingredients for ice cream formula or something like that, but not list everything, but you can identify what it is. So those are really the whole asset list in your FDD. And again, item 13 and 14 cover that. Oops. And here are some of the non-intellectual property issues that even as a trademark franchise lawyer, I come across almost all the time. You need to be aware of the antitrust laws in the United States. Many times, companies try to make sure that there's, they call them non-solicitation provisions, where if you're hired by this company, you can't go to the sister company. Well, those laws are illegal in the United States. Many of the states have come down on franchisors who are trying to prevent the employees of their franchisees from going from one franchisee in one state to another franchisee in another state. So you have to be aware of these laws. The Federal Trade Commission is always on the watch for, improper conduct by a franchisor or false statements and representations made by franchisors about their products and services. You need to be aware of it's called the FTC for short. And then you have to be aware of horizontal and vertical relationships, making sure you're not setting prices or doing things that are under those laws illegal in the United States. And then you have, so that's all the federal laws. And then again, you have that dual layer of state laws that you need to be aware of. So if you're based in Florida or based in Texas or based in New York or California, you need to be aware that California is going to watch every little thing you do in your relationships, and they're going to govern and legislate on those things, and they do. And you have to be aware of those relationship laws that you have, unfair competition laws, non-competes, and then even the privacy laws in the United States. Unlike Europe, which has the GDPR, in the United States, California has its law. I think Illinois has a biometric privacy law. Other states, I think Utah just passed its own privacy law. You have to be aware of the different laws in the different states and your obligations to comply with them. And so we're now going to wrap it up a little bit. Emmy?
Básicamente este gráfico es lo que nosotros trabajamos.
Basically, this plot is what we worked. On one side, we would have like the menu of services that we offer, and in the upper side, we have the time and months. A program like this one could last between 8 to 10 months to be completed, to be able to be a franchiser. It's the time that it takes in the United States to be able to be a franchisor, moving legal documents, guides of operation, and others. But basically, this is describing the timeline of what's going to happen. First, defining the strategies, the fees, canons, all this business information that will be given to an attorney so they can make the legal registration. Once the attorney starts registering in any state where they will offer the franchise, they will ensure that they can apply formally and make the registry formally if it's a state that requires this step. And while the lawyer is working, we can start building the manual of operations, the guide of operations, start thinking and everything that has to do in the business. A guide of operations in the United States, on average, has 300 to 500 pages, including pictures, including steps that have to be followed, recipes, segment of HR, what to do, what not to do, what role will the franchisor take, what is the role of the ones that are buying the franchise. This guide must be used as a control of quality, but also as a method of training for that candidate. So preparing documentation is a key element. It's fundamental for the success in this process. And afterwards, we have other elements of marketing. For example, a marketing plan where they know where and how to find that candidate that is ideal for that brand, that has the money, the experience, that makes them a good match or a great match. There are other trainings and other elements of how to qualify or qualify a prospect. One of the most difficult points for the franchisors in the United States is to have to say no to a candidate that has the check ready to buy the franchise. I mean, having the capacity to say, no, you have the money, but not the experience, or I don't think you're a good candidate for this brand. Knowing how to score or qualify that prospect.
Just what iFranchise, its history, and then a little bit about the approach and development that iFranchise provides. I will say that I tell my clients on the business level, don't come to me first, go to someone like Emmy, because Emmy can really help on the business side. I can help on the legal, but the business side should probably come first. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias por...
Thank you very much for your attention and patience before lunch.
But if anyone has any questions, by all means, you can come to us after we shut the lights.
Sí, estamos abiertos a preguntas para los que quisieran. Adelante, por favor.
Thank you very much. I'm Gabriel Leonardo from Brazil, and I understand, Emiliano, you have a lot of experience in the U.S. already, and you probably will understand much better my concern, because I never lived in the U.S.
Okay.
But I understand that for the U.S. market, especially when you are directing your services to the Hispanic groups or Latin American groups, including Brazilians.
Sure.
Not all cultures mingle automatically, in the sense that a franchise originated from Brazil will not automatically sell to Mexicans or Mexican origin Americans. And I understand this may happen also between Spanish-speaking countries. So what would you say about that? I mean, how easy or how challenging is it for a franchise operation, namely from Argentina, to really be able to sell to people with origins in Guatemala or El Salvador?
Yep, very good question. I appreciate the question too. There are very different components that they will answer or to give you. It's not one bullet that will kill that issue or topic. First of all, the first thing that we do is we look at the concept. What is this concept? What it does? What generates? Who consumes this product? How easy or how credible it is? What type of reputation? How easy will be to duplicate that in any market? So can we clone this because consumers profile, because many other different conditions that will make a perfect match for people. Sometimes products are recognized by a culture, but not necessarily strictly they will be the only one consuming that product. In cases of Havaianas from their country, we helped them. They came into the US, but those flip-flops are used by everybody. But also we told Havaianas, don't go to Alaska, you're not gonna sell one flip-flop. So there are suggestions. We also have clients in the formal wear, and we told them, don't franchise. The US is going casual. Nobody's wearing suits anymore. You're not gonna sell the franchises that you think. So depending on the nature of the business, depending on what is required to duplicate, who uses, there's so many different components that we have about 12 different criteria that we look in the concept before we say this is franchisable. Go ahead.
I just want to add, this goes to what I said very early on about the concept being tested before you make the investment. And I think your question, really very astute question, is really, it's the answer can maybe be revealed when you, in the United States, let's use the food concept because it's easiest, but there are food expos all over the United States. If the franchisor were to open up, just take a stand, which is not a lot of money, right? Set it up, see what happens, and then you would probably hire a company like Emiliano to watch what happens. Who comes? Who's tasting, right? And then how are they reacting? You can ask questions from the people who, and you do it casually. You don't do it obviously. He's like, what do you think? What do you think that means? What does that Latin American brand name mean to you? Does it speak to you? And if only Argentinians come up to the stand, you may have a little bit of a problem. Yeah. But if you find that every race, color, and creed in the United States, in the big cities, you have every race, color, and creed sort of mixed together. If you go to Montana, little bit of a different thing. But as Emmy just said, certain things just won't sell in Montana. They won't sell in Alaska. But in New York, Chicago, LA, they may be different cultures and they may come from different countries, but they do all live together, right? Maybe not always peacefully, but they do all live together. And if you take advantage of these opportunities to expose the brand to the variety of cultures and people and races and colors that are there, and you just take a look, see what happens, chances are that will be reproduced in that city where you took that little test, did that little marketplace survey. That would be my guess. And I think in the Polo Comparos, that's a very good example, I think, of how they got, they come from Guatemala, right? Yeah. But, there's one on Long Island in New York where I live. I can't wait to go now that I know what it is, right? But I love fried chicken. Who doesn't love fried chicken? Everyone eats fried chicken. It's got to be good. I hope it is good. But it's a good example, I think, of how to come smart, come into the U.S. with a strategy. I think you were talking about strategy before.
That, and also keeping in mind a number that I shared earlier, about 40% of prospects or people are looking to get in franchising are open to new things from whatever country. The one thing that you need to understand is also who is your audience, who is your prospect. And once you understand what they look like, then you can target them. But also keeping in mind that in the US, franchisees are lazy. They don't want to fly to Brazil to get trained. So you have to have your operations in the US to be trained. But other than that, you can overcome certain things to maximize that sales process in general. Did we answer your question?
I can imagine that a lot of franchisees might enjoy a trip to Rio to see how it
for
operates.
vacation, not for a training.
Any other questions? I don't want to keep anyone. Good. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Recuerde que a las 19:15 horas nos encontramos en el lobby de su hotel para descubrir los sabores de la cocina paisa en una singular noche en el Museo El Castillo.